Have you experienced the awesome power of the Panasonic Real 3DO system? Obviously.
Presenting 3DO, the most advanced home gaming system in the universe. It's time to put away your toys.
3DO from Panasonic, Gold Star, and Creative Labs. A new low price and free games.
Mind-blowing graphics of Panasonic Real 3DO. 3DO.
Experience, the retrospective podcast about the Panasonic 3DO interactive multiplayer system and the company behind it, the 3DO company. For this episode, we're going to be talking about the various different hardware incarnations of the 3DO system. And for this episode, I have another guest, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Casey. I'm from Desert Level Gaming. You can find us at twitch.tv/Desert Level Gaming, youtube.com/Desert Level Gaming, and also host of the podcast Gaming in the Desert.
Nice. So how did you discover the 3DO?
Well, so my coming to knowledge of the 3DO was through the Sega CD, actually. So I am an old school gamer. I started with with a Nintendo Entertainment System, then Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo. But once I saw that full motion video games were a thing, that realism was kind of brought to the table. And this was before, the advanced polygons and everything that that we'd come to know through the PlayStation variants and the Xbox. But I was very much drawn to the realism and that interactive movie type video game experience. So
Nice.
The Sega CD was really cool for me, but the graphics were super grainy. We were still kind of on a lower spec hardware. They weren't able to render out those graphics at a quality that was, almost unplayable. So when I found out about the 3DO and your intro commercial was one of those things that was like, oh my gosh, this is the real deal. This is something that's going to be like reality. And so I had to have one. But of course that $700 price tag was quite unattainable. And, we were a lower middle class family. My parents were split at the time. So my dad, bless him, had always fueled my video game hobby. And he put in, I know, an ungodly amount of overtime, but was able to get me one for Christmas. But it was the Gold Star variant because at the time, and also admittedly coming in late to the game in the 3DO's life, it was already on deep discount, so we were able to attain one. So all of my full motion video game dreams were about to come true. Everything from the American Laser games to the digital pictures games, all those Tom Zito games. I loved all of that stuff, and I still do to this day. I still play those. So I did have kind of a storied experience with the 3DO, especially because having the Gold Star variant, as we'll get into when we start talking a little bit more about hardware, I had some issues with it. So I'll stop right there and we could talk a little bit more and kind of work our way into the topic.
Excellent. So I'd said in previous episodes, I didn't grow up with the 3DO. I discovered it much later on. So it's actually really cool to have someone who actually grew up with its perspective on the system. Because I'm actually really fascinated. This podcast is both, like, in a lot of ways, a learning experience for myself, but I also want to educate certain guests at the same time. So this one's actually pretty cool because it's actually me learning about a lot of things at the same time. So I guess, like, going into it now, like, to start with the different hardware variations, as I stated in the previous episode, the big thing about the 3DO was it wasn't so much a console as much as it was an audio standard. And the whole idea was it was kind of going to be like VHS or like DVD or Blu-ray like we have now, where the whole idea was the company, 3DO company, designed the overall specs for the system, and then they would sell the rights to different companies to make their own version of the hardware. Meanwhile, they would license the games for at the time, very low fee compared to its competitors. The problem was, though, because 3DO made all their money off the games, companies like Panasonic and Gold Star in particular, the only way they would make any money off this was they had to sell their system basically for what it was worth. And for Panasonic in particular, that was a $700 price tag at launch, which was insane then, and even now it's like 1,200, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Like,
No, definitely.
Mhm.
And on top of that, the specs of the system were so advanced for the time, and the chipset was super new, that there were a lot of developers that didn't even know how to develop for this system, and that's what made it such a hard thing. It was definitely very advanced for its time, and we could go down the specs in a little bit, but that was just a little note I wanted to throw in because it was I mean, for the time, it was cutting edge. And I know in your
Oh yeah,
last episode you talked about it being, Time Magazine's
product of the
product of
year.
the year for, I think that was 1993 when it came out. But
Mhm.
yeah, it's it was a marvel.
What's crazy too is at the time, I think the only real 3D we had was, besides like the arcade space, the only real 3D consoles I think were like the Super FX chip, and maybe I think the Sega Virtual Processor was out by this point, which was
Yeah.
still very. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Kit.
I was going to say that was still very early, like rudimentary 3D. Like they were just getting off the ground. Like the 3DO was the first. I want to say it was the first console that was really out the gate, like capable of 3D.
Yeah, it was. So being that it was a true 32-bit RISC-based CPU, it actually was able to do those 3D graphics for real. Whereas with some of the Super FX and some of the earlier system stuff, it was a little, I don't want to say trickery, but it was more like simulated 3D than actual
Mhm.
true 3D. And that's where I made the comment about it being very difficult to develop for, because developers up until that point had always been in 2D mode, right? So whether side scrolling or just getting into kind of that simulated 3D with some of the earlier games like Wolfenstein, Doom, some of those first person shooters, thinking in the third dimension was a very difficult stretch for a lot of these companies. And also consider a lot of these companies. And I'll try to stay off of software for another time, but a lot of these guys were just they were coming in from really small developers going to newer, smaller, lesser known at the time, but now big developers. But
Mhm.
yeah, it was a big stretch.
It was, and like for the time too, like the overall like idea of like what to do with all this space was still very like new to a lot of these developers. Like going back to how you'd mentioned the Sega CD, one of the big reasons why full motion video was such a huge thing at the time was because developers just didn't know what to do with all that extra space the CD offered them. So
Yeah,
for the majority of the games, their solution was video and like CD quality audio, which I mean, I agree with you on a lot of cases. I do love those like full motion video games because I think they're like in that like so bad it's good kind of like area.
yes, absolutely.
Like they're very entertaining in like hindsight. Um, I do get I do get a lot of people's like dislike for them though, because a lot of them literally are just watching movies pretty much.
Oh
And
yeah.
like the best Sega CD games in a lot of ways were like the working designs RPGs or like the side scrolling platformers that you'd find every now and then.
Hmm.
Problem is though, all those games are absurdly expensive these days.
This is true. Yeah, this is definitely true. But yeah, it was it was such a strange time in gaming, and I mean, just remember being there. It was like, one, we didn't have internet, so going to a major video game editor outlet like what we know today it wasn't available back then. I had to go to my local grocery store while my mom was shopping for groceries, and check out the magazines, game what was it, GameSpot, or I can't even remember them, the magazines. I still got a box full of them in the closet. But those are the only way I got to find out about games like Way of the Warrior and Wing Commander, and some of these other I'll say great because they were great to me, but some of these games that weren't really highly regarded at the end of the day.
True. Although the 3DO was the ironically the 3DO was actually the debuting like console for a lot of game series that are still around to this day, which is pretty nuts.
Oh yeah, I mean Need for Speed's one of my favorite. I mean that's how I was introduced to Need for Speed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because a lot of kids, later on when I was in my high school days, it was Need for Speed Underground and some of those games, and it was like, oh, I've been playing Need for Speed for a long time. So yeah, it was cool. It was
One of
cool.
my favorite versions of Road Rash as well.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, the best version of Road Rash.
I mean,
Absolutely.
speaking of full motion video, all the cutscenes, the Soundgarden intro.
Okay. Oh man, you almost made me bust out in song, breaking out of my rusty cage. I don't want to
Yeah.
get us in trouble though with copyright, so I'll leave my
Yes.
terrible singing to another episode.
All right. So I guess like to start off, we should probably start with the original 3DO, which was the Panasonic FZ1 model, which is kind
Yeah,
of in a lot of ways seen as the definitive 3DO, and it's usually the one that like appears in the most media involving the 3DO.
and that's the one I always wanted. So I love the design. I always call it the Castle 3DO because it looks like those four pillars on the end of it are like these the big pillars of a castle. I remember when I first started lusting after the 3DO, going to Universal Studios Hollywood, and they had a Panasonic store
Oh,
way
really?
back then, and they had kiosks with 3DO, and my parents had to peel me away from that place. It was so cool. But yeah, that's the first time I actually laid eyes on it in the wild, and I absolutely had to have one. But the uh, the Panasonic version is always regarded as the highest quality one. So you've got the FC1, that was the first one, that was kind of the pioneer, and then you
And
had the Gold Star and some of the
mhm.
other ones that we'll get into.
Now, before
Um,
we get into the Gold Star, though, I wanted to
yeah,
mention the Panasonic FC1. While it's considered the highest like quality one, it does have some odd quirks to it that have made it a little. The problem with it is it's super high quality, but it's also very there. It's very hard to find a functioning one these days because
yeah, no,
it
100%. Go ahead.
because it had that So it was one of the first really early systems to have a front loading like automated tray, which at the time was really cool. Nowadays, I mean, nowadays we have those like suction things, which is even more complicated. But the tray was pretty powerful, and it's actually really aggressive when you open it up because the thing like shoots out and like shoots back in. And I'm like, geez. They are very prone to failing though because they have those old rubber bands that like wear out after a while. Um, Another odd quirk about the system is the I think the Gold Star was the same. The power cord was like hardwired into it.
Yes, yes, and honestly, that was one of my favorite features of it because
You'd never lose the
as I
cord.
yeah, well, as I would learn to hate in later generations, that giant brick, especially
Yes.
with like the Xboxes.
And another fun, fascinating thing about it is it doesn't have like proprietary audio and video imports. All the imports are just like standard based ones that you just attach into the back. Like it has the red, white, and yellows and S video like just built right into the back that you can use any like off the shelf cord, which I think had was a lot to do with the whole like VHS mentality at the
Mhm.
time. They were going for that whole like you didn't need a special anything, you could just plug and play essentially.
Oh yeah, yeah, and that was great too. And I was so happy I didn't have to use the dreaded RF connection
Yeah,
like I was so used to with the previous generations.
S video
But
was pretty cool at the time too, just
oh
having S
yeah,
video built right in.
S
um
video was the greatest. That was like, oh my gosh, this quality. So I mean, before we had HD, right? But
yeah.
my CRT TV, that was, we had very old television sets. In fact, we were one of those families that's stacked television sets on top of television sets. Like one would die and that would become the entertainment center. We put another television set over it, whichever one was working at the time. And I feel like everybody did. My grandparents, my parents. I mean, I did that while I was in college. So
Nice. That's funny. Another odd quirk though about the FC1, and this is probably the one downside I'd say to it, it doesn't have a built-in memory manager for its built-in memory, which is very peculiar for the time. I guess it was like the first real one of the first systems with built-in memory. I believe the Sega CD also had built-in memory, but you could like access it through the menu at the time.
yeah, I'm trying to remember what if you let's see, if you did a specific input on the startup for the Sega CD, it would take you to a menu. I don't believe that was the case with the 3DO, and in fact,
The
I feel
3DO, I
like
believe you needed to get like this. There was like a memory manager CD that you could buy separately.
Yeah, and I was at the time definitely not in tune with those things, so I wasn't aware of any of those things that I could buy. I do know that there were a lot of planned peripherals for these that never really quite made it to fruition, specific to the RAM. But I think a lot of these things were kind of pie in the sky, and it was a great idea to build, but nothing ever came of it.
Hmm.
And then specifically, when we start talking about the M2, um, it's gosh, it's sad. Like, it's
Hmm.
sad. Such a console that was so ahead of its time. It had all of the things that you would kind of check off the boxes to, like, what would make a killer system that everybody would want to buy, and watch it fail so colossally. It's I mean, that's like borderline Shakespearean tragedy as far as the video game scape is concerned. But
I
here
had
we are
mentioned,
still talking about it, and I love it
yeah,
still.
I had mentioned when I was talking to Josh in the previous episode that in a lot of ways the PlayStation ended up being everything the 3DO wanted to be as a video game console, which is really sad in hindsight.
Man.
Before we move on to oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'll just share one quick sad story when I kind of felt like that nail in the coffin happened with the 3DO. I was walking through a Sears and I saw a PlayStation kiosk, and it was playing Rebel Assault. And I
Mhm.
remember I just got Rebel Assault, and I thought it looked kind of good. Then I saw it on the PlayStation. I was like, oh my gosh, this game looks so much better.
Oh yeah.
What is this? I gotta buy another system, and that's also I kind of when I think I woke up to like the whole console war thing too, because
Mhm.
before it was just kind of like a Pokemon thing, like catch them all, but now it was like, oh my gosh, now I got to think about this stuff before I make purchases again. Well, not that
Mhm.
I bought it because my parents bought it for me, but it's getting older, wiser.
Yeah. I was gonna say though, like the one other weird, interesting thing about before we move on to the Gold Star was for the Panasonic, I believe the FC1 was the only Panasonic that actually had the famous 3DO intro with like the
Wait,
space like asteroids going through the sky.
yes, that
Because the
was
Gold Star didn't have that, I believe, right?
no, it didn't. That was a big disappointment when I turned on my Gold Star the first time.
What's funny though is it only does the asteroid field if you don't have a game installed. Like it just goes right into the game if you have a game in there. It's weird. It's cool, but it's also weird at the same time.
It's like primitive screensavers. Yeah.
In a lot of ways, yeah. But I guess now we'll move on to the Gold Star, which was the second 3DO that was introduced, and I'll let you take the floor because you actually grew up with the thing.
Yeah, so I got the Gold Star, and I was just happy to have a 3DO. But you always kind of had that feeling that it was a little bit of an inferior product because, yeah, it wasn't. There were a few features that were missing. The thing that I will disagree with the masses on, though, and this is highly controversial topic that I'm bringing to the 3DO Experience podcast, is that the controller was inferior to the FC1s, and I have to disagree because I loved that controller, and maybe not for any other reason than I just felt it felt better. The shoulder buttons were a little fatter, but the D pad was a lot larger, and me
The
being a
controller
fighting game
itself was a lot
enthusiast.
bigger too.
Yeah, but being a fighting game enthusiast, I
Mhm.
felt that it was easier to do some of those quarter circle inputs with that controller a lot easier. So I still, even if I were to get a FC10 or an FC1, I think I'd still try to get a Gold Star controller. Still the same daisy chain situation as with all of the other ones.
What's
That
fun
was
is you can mix and match them too, which is really cool.
yeah. That and I think at one point when I was collecting and I acquired a Gold Star, I did get both controllers just so I could say I had a piece of the Panasonic one. but
Nice.
Yeah, that was really cool. The problem with the Gold Star was that it was plagued with quality issues, and I've owned two of them.
Hmm.
So the first one that I owned broke relatively quickly, and it was that CD tray.
Hmm.
So that thing popped out just as hard on the Gold Star as it did with the Panasonic.
Panasonic.
I don't know if it was like hydraulic loaded or what, or those rubber bands were just super duper tight, but it failed relatively quickly, and I actually, not being in the age of the Nintendo or the internet, we definitely had Nintendo, but not being in the age of the internet, there wasn't a way to like just Google like either how to
How to
fix
fix
or
it.
where to send. So I was with on that manual on that back page, like calling that 800 number and like, what do I need to do? And I'm just a kid. So I found out, where to ship it, where to send it. I think it ended up costing about $150 to get fixed, and it took months. It took months. I was without the 3DO. Finally got it back, and it was great. Um, Fast forward many years to where I acquired my second Gold Star, and it was like almost right away the laser failed. And I know like as a whole the 3DOs typically experience that laser failure, so I ended up buying like three of those lasers just to kind of future proof myself.
Hmm.
Um, Learn how to swap it in, and then I ended up selling that 3DO as well. So one of these days I'm gonna own I'll own one of the FC1 originals, or maybe if I can get my hands on some of the rarer systems, we'll probably get into. Um,
Mm. So the Gold Star always fascinated me, like because it does. My favorite thing about the 3DO is like they all look so different from each other, like to the point where like they're like borderline different like machines entirely.
oh yeah, the Gold Star definitely had that VCR look to it, and I think Gold Star being who they were was probably more um, acclimated to that type of a design.
Mhm.
Now, jumping ahead a little bit to some of those that didn't make it, the Samsung also looked kind of VCR
Yeah,
like as well. And I think maybe it was just easier to mold plastic that way. That's the only thing I can think of, and I'm positive that that's probably what drove the initial cost with the FC1 was that four column design that was probably just a bear to create at the time. If you flip one of those things over, you can see that those pillars don't even have feet. They're just
no, they
kind of
don't.
open, which is kind of strange to me. A $700 system, you might put a little feet cap or some rubber at the bottom or something, but no such luck.
What's interesting, I guess, for like people who don't know, the company Gold Star, they're nowadays known as LG.
Yes.
To the people who because Gold Star is a name that I knew growing up, but like nowadays you'll never see a Gold Star anymore because it's now LG, and LG is a company that is very prolific these days, and they still kind of have the quality issues that they've always had, but
Yeah,
that's just nitpicking these days.
those TVs produce some really good blacks, though. Oh my goodness, I love me an LG C1's good TV.
Nice.
Um, no promo, but
So I've also heard I'd like your opinion on this. I've also heard the Gold Star had like some compatibility issues with some of the software, or is this a
um,
myth?
no, I mean I'm sure it does. When when I had my games, I never really had an issue with any of them. Like the major titles. Now, I didn't ever have really any of the obscure games back then
Hmm.
until I started collecting. But by the time I started burning lasers, I was so afraid to put a disc in the game in the console. I think it's ultimately led me to get rid of it. Was well, no, there are other issues too, but I was kind of afraid of burning those lasers out because I'm not that tech savvy when it comes to actually swapping stuff out. Barely trust myself opening up the side of a computer, to be honest.
Hmm.
So yeah, I never experienced compatibility issues with the software, but I'd have to read a little bit more into that.
Yeah, I've heard that like as a I've heard that from multiple sources that like I guess the Gold Stars had some compatibility issues, but I've never actually like found a list that actually like lists these supposed issues. I always theorized maybe like the Panasonic release titles, maybe, but even then, I think that might be a stretch.
How bad would that be if Crash and Burn, like the only launch title for the 3DO, didn't work on the Gold Star?
True. Now, the Gold Star technically came out later, so technically, I feel like there might have been more games when it released.
Oh yeah, for sure. Let's see. So the Gold Star, if I'm not mistaken, it was released about a year later in '94.
Hmm.
So yeah, by then 3DO would have had a pretty healthy lineup of games. including some of the more known ones that we were aware of, but then also a lot of the ports of those full motion video games that
Mhm.
we all, not a lot of us, know and love, but I love.
They're
But
pretty
yeah,
nostalgic.
yeah, definitely. What's that?
They're pretty nostalgic these days, especially like considering they're putting them all on the Switch now, which is pretty cool.
I'm I know we're talking hardware today, but gosh, yes, I own every single one of those ports on the Switch now,
Nice.
and
It
on
just
PC.
a little off topic, but it still makes me laugh to this day. The famous Nintendo Howard Lincoln quote of Night Trap will never be on a Nintendo system.
Thank you.
Yeah, that
Play
lasted
that.
very.
I play that game on my Nintendo Switch, and I always quote that man. Yep. And
It's funny
oh,
because
wow.
that's the first time I got to play it because getting a Sega CD copy is so expensive these days. I was at a convention actually recently, and I saw a 3DO copy, and they wanted like $100 for it. I was like, nope. I'm like, not worth that.
Oh my gosh, yeah. No, I know, and I think there aren't no. Well, sorry, I don't want to drag it off topic too much, but all of that history is just so much fun. It's so much fun.
No, don't worry about it. Um, so you had said earlier when we were first talking that you had a pretty fun Gold Star story, like with your system.
Uh, yeah, the story about it breaking and then me finding out how much it was going to cost to fix. Well, my parents had already dumped a few $100s. I mean, they got it on deep discount for me, but by the time it failed, they're like, yeah, no, we're not putting any money into that. So you're gonna have to you're gonna have to come up with that money on your own.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of a lot of the reason for the title of my whole persona online is around the desert, and that's because that's where I grew up and that's where I live, and honestly, that's where I've had a lot of my most fondest video game memories, including this one, where I actually had to go out into my grandmother's acreage of backyard space and clear weeds out for like an entire summer. It felt like before I had enough money to send my gold star in, which was so that was kind of the funny story. But all of the critters and the scary animals, they say everything in the desert's trying to kill you, but uh, that's not true. But unless you're going to town with a rake and a shovel as a kid, and you discover a rattlesnake or scorpions or something like that. So yeah, I had a pretty harrowing experience working for my money to get the gold star fixed.
Nice. So, I guess to close off on the Gold Star, overall, like build wise, like I've never actually seen one physically. Like, what would you say, like from like a just like a like feel wise, like how did it feel? Like, did it feel like cheap or was it kind of like solid?
It was totally solid. In fact,
Was it?
and I think this is by mostly due to the power supply being inside of the machine, with as we're talking that the cords attached to it. It made it definitely feel a lot more substantial. I do remember it always being very heavy for a video game console
Yeah,
because
the
of that.
Panasonic's pretty heavy. Like it's a
Yeah,
chunky
it
stuff.
felt stout. Yeah, it felt stout. I mean, even the button push, the kind of that tactile feedback you got from the power button, being that the FC1 had that kind of almost rectangular, roundish rectangular
Yeah.
slim button. This one had just a full round button, and it always felt like it had a good springiness to it. Same with the reset or the disc tray out button. It
Okay.
was all fine. I never had a problem with plugging in the controllers or even the daisy chaining the controllers.
I
Uh,
still think the daisy chain is the funniest thing ever.
it is, and what's funny is that was always a selling point when I was like, oh mom, or dad, can I get this system? I could play with my brother and my cousins and you guys, and it could be like this cool. I don't think I remember a game that had like 4, 5, 6 players. Like
They do exist. I know they. I think Twisted the Game Show is one of the few.
Twisted. Okay,
That's one of the few I want to get like a big like group of people to play at some point because that game is ridiculous. But
that'll be fun. We got to figure out how to do that.
what's funny though is about the daisy chaining. I guess to because it is technically hardware specific. We had mentioned it previously within the last episode, but because of like the way daisy chaining is, Josh actually brought this up. Imagine if like you're player 1 and you're pissed off at player 2, and you just unplug player two's controller, but at the same time, then you screw over player 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah, I remember that. It's
like,
so true.
It's one of those funny designs where it's like, wow, they didn't think this through, but at the same time, it's so fascinating how it works.
Oh yeah. Well, that's how my brother never beat me in video games. It's just unplug it, and then once he got mad at me and unplugged his, thinking he was unplugging mine. He's quite a bit younger than me, and ended up accidentally unplugging his controller. He didn't quite understand how that connectivity worked, but
Yeah,
oh man, I got so many fond memories of this thing.
that's really fun because like I grew up with a PlayStation at the time, and me and my sister, who's my co-host on my other podcast, she was the famous controller thrower. Like whenever she lost, she chucked the controller. So I have PlayStation 1 controllers that are just destroyed because they hit the wall so many times.
Oh my gosh, you got to put them in a frame and like give it to her for her birthday.
I got to see if I still have some of them. Like these things were destroyed.
Edit that out so we don't ruin the surprise for her.
I don't think she listens to this podcast, so I don't have to worry. But so I guess one final thing I wanted to ask you. So the Panasonic has one of my favorite audio like video like CD players like of any video game console.
Mm-hmm.
What did the Gold Star have?
It had the same.
So it was
I don't know if it was exactly the same, but it had like the audio visualization type. I always call it screensaver, but you could toggle through it, so you could have the bunch of 3DO symbols going in waveform to the music, and then if you hit the button again, it would kind of go psychedelic and start spinning around, and then you would be like flying through, like just this psychedelic madness of just meshed together colors, and
then if you hit it again, it would become the 3DO logo psychedelic.
Yes, and it was so trippy. Yeah, and it would imprint the 3DO logo over it, and then it'd be kind of spinning.
Yeah. Okay, so
that was the best audio player of all time. It was the best.
It was identical then. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's good to know because I always to me that was like my favorite like thing about the 3DO is that music player is just hilarious. Like there's just something funny about that, but at the same time it's so cool. Like because even like looking at the PlayStation, even the PlayStation's like video player wasn't nearly that like crazy for the time. I think the 3DO was like one of the first that really introduced a concept like that.
It was, yeah. So the Sega CD also had an audio player as well, but it was just kind of like just a heads up display,
kind
of, interface, and it was clean and everything, but it wasn't that cool.
I think the only other one from that era was the Atari Jaguar CD, but like nobody owned one of those, so
I kind of want one, but I know those things are as problematic as 3DO perceived to be.
They're like finding one of those that works is like almost impossible from what I've heard.
It's they're pricey. They're pricey.
Okay, so now moving on. So then there's the third 3DO, the one that gets kind of overlooked, the Sanyo.
Yep.
Which was
Sanyo.
I'm not gonna lie, I really want a Sanyo 3DO at some point. It looks so cool.
It really does, and again, it kind of has that VCR early DVD player look, and
you know what my favorite part about it is? The 3DO like logo is like etched into the top of it.
Yeah,
it just looks clean. Like the Panasonic, I think looks more attractive, but like the Sanyo, there's something about that. I'm like, that thing looks nice. But the problem with the Sanyo, though, for people who don't know, is that was the Japanese 3DO, and it was only released in Japan.
Yep.
And I believe Sanyo is actually related to Panasonic, like they're like sister companies.
I don't know about that. I totally agree with you. I think it's the best looking. I've heard rumor also that it was also the best selling in Japan because it was, well, not only Japan only, but it was, I mean, of the three, I believe, and I might need to be fact checked on this, but it was the best selling of all of the consoles variants.
I
But
I
yeah,
believe
I've never
that.
seen one.
So what I know about the Sanyos were they were the exclusively released ones in Japan. They actually have the same controllers, I think, as the Panasonics.
Let me see. I think you might be right, actually. At least the same shape.
Yeah, well, I believe it says Sanyo on the front, but it's the same like
It's the same. They
design.
didn't go with the gold star
Yeah,
setup. Nobody liked that one except me.
my sister liked it. She wouldn't because she used it during our podcast we did on our other show.
You know what? Oddly enough, the photo that I'm looking at right now, the controller is branded Panasonic.
Really?
Yeah,
I wonder if that's just a mistake on the photo.
I maybe.
So I did just do a little research. Panasonic does actually own Sanyo now, but they didn't purchase the company until 2009.
Hmm. So hard to say if even the 3DO somehow led to that partnership that led to the acquisition. Who knows?
It's hard to say. I mean, I'd like to think so, but at the same time, that seems a little much.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Oh, I'm stretching big time.
yeah, yeah.
Big time stretching.
What's funny about the Sanyo model though is it's the one that I know the littlest about. Even though from what I've heard, it's pretty much identical to the Panasonic, like
Yeah.
in terms of design. Like the Gold Star, it doesn't have the asteroid field intro because I actually looked up online what its intro was, and it's very similar to the Gold Star. It just shows the Sanyo logo, and then it
Mm-hmm.
pops up with the 3DO logo.
Oh, okay. It's interesting. That might be one I have to acquire when someday I visit Japan.
I'd like to because the cool thing about 3DOs they're region free. Like there's no like region locking in them. So like
Yes.
you could theoretically buy one, just get like a converter for the plug, and
Mm-hmm.
then just use it. Because I don't
Yeah.
see because I think because it's NSTC, so it wouldn't really have an issue over here.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I know you mentioned in the last episode uh, about the discs weren't even locked either, and
Nah, like
that just blows my mind.
you could burn any game and just like play them.
Yeah, that's so crazy to think of a time where even the discs, the compact discs themselves, were not. There was no security, no anything from keeping them from. But then again, there was also no technology back then that was readily available to rip a CD. So I
Yeah,
guess
they
it was
didn't.
a problem.
It was kind of a thing like they didn't really think of. Like I think the only company really thinking about that at the time was Nintendo, because Nintendo has always been like afraid of CDs for whatever reason.
Yeah, yeah, we're gonna make really little CDs with the GameCube, which is another one I love. But,
Yeah.
um, so the other one that was, I guess, a little less widely known as well was the 3DO blaster. So
Oh, the
the
Creative
PC
Labs.
attachment, yeah, the Creative Blaster. Um, that's another one I would love to get my hands on as well, and I have no idea how I would hook it up or connect
So
it, but
I've seen one video of someone getting it to work. It is like the weird. So apparently these things are really hard to find nowadays. Like
yeah.
there's like there's only a small amount of them. And, like a lot of them are in Germany for whatever reason. But
Hmm.
so I guess like as a brief explanation, the Creative Blaster was essentially it was the 3DO's hardware on a PCI board
Hmm.
that you would plug into the side of like a Windows 95 or maybe it was even DOS still at that point, like a DOS computer, and you needed a creative CD drive for it to work. But essentially, you had a 3DO inside your PC, and then you could play 3DO games on your PC. But it wasn't like it was running a program. It was literally just a 3DO running inside your PC, and you could actually like overlay other like you could. I've seen videos of like you can play like solitaire over 3DO games in the background because it's essentially a capture card
Yeah.
the way it was designed, and that's a really cool idea. But at the same time, Josh had brought this up. It feels like it would be really counterintuitive at the same time because it
Yeah.
kind of cancels out the whole point of owning a console at that point.
Well, yeah, and who's doing that now?
Yeah, exactly.
So I just love like the forward thinking Nate, and I think this is why it's one of my favorite consoles of all time, or even just console concepts of all time, is that it was so ahead of its time.
A lot of things that it came up with are standard nowadays, or are still being attempted to become standard these days,
You know,
which is interesting.
so the only one that I also want to discuss just briefly, if we have time, is the 3DO Robo.
Okay.
So the 3DO Robo, another one that's also not so widely known, but basically it was an FC1, but it was a CD changer. So there
I
were
know this one,
five.
yes.
Yeah, so there were five different CDs that you could stick in this, or five different games at a time, and it was only released in Japan, and it was primarily used in the love hotels.
Oh, okay. That's funny,
Yes,
actually.
yeah. So it's also it's actually it's considered the rarest of the production 3DO units, just a touch rarer than the Creative Blaster. But there's it seems like there were more actually made. They just didn't quite make it. But yeah, these were a staple in the Love Hotel because, as we know, 3DO was also known for putting less than family friendly content
Yes.
on their games. So you
And
know,
especially in Japan, because Japan, I love Japan, but they don't have standards like we do in America. And a lot of the times, the console manufacturers do have standards. So a lot of times they'll dump these less than desirable games on the system least that's least desirable,
yeah,
which is how where the 3DO ended up. Which is actually arguably a lot of the ways maybe one of the reasons why the Sanyo was so popular.
yeah, absolutely, possibly.
Because
But
I
it's
mentioned it, the Xbox 360 was known for this in Japan as well,
Oh, that I didn't know that.
because no one cared about it in Japan.
Yeah. But yeah, definitely. So the secondary use also was for karaoke bars, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe 3DO had a karaoke on demand variant as well.
They did.
Being karaoke is a very big part of Japanese culture as well.
Hmm.
It's just interesting to as I still consider this more of a gaming console. It was absolutely a multiplayer, a full media experience, which was really neat, and again, just way ahead of its time.
Now, one version that we actually neglected to talk about that we actually probably should step back and talk about is the FC10.
Oh yes, the FC10. You're right. We
We
can't
kind
forget
of
about the
we
FC10.
kind of glazed over because it's it's weird because the FC10 is actually I think the most common 3DO you'll find out and about,
Hmm.
but it's also like the one that no one really talks about,
No.
which is
Oh,
interesting because it's actually superior to the FC10 one and the Gold Star in a lot of ways.
exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, you didn't have tray failures. The laser was not as prone to failure for whatever reason. It just yeah, it was a superior system,
So
and
I
for a
guess
time when I was looking for them, when I was trying to collect, it was also the most expensive.
because it came
I
out a
think
lot later and there was less made, I believe.
yeah, I think it was just about before they died. I feel like it was kind of the Hail Mary pass that Panasonic was trying to throw up before its ultimate demise. If I'm not mistaken, and I'll have to fact check myself again, but I think it was '96 that it came out.
It was late, and I know it was significantly cheaper. Like it was actually, honestly, it was what the 3DO should have been to begin with.
Hmm. Yeah.
Some interesting things about the FC10 though. Um, as we said, it's a top loader now, so it actually looks the most like a video game console out of all of them.
Hmm.
It also has a removable power cord. I think the power supply was still built in though. It was just a standard, like kind of like a PlayStation or Saturn cord.
Yeah, it was. It just had kind of that the input part. You just plug it into the back
Console
there.
itself.
Yep, exactly.
Um, it still had the red, white, and yellows. I think the S video may have been removed. I'm not sure on that. I'd have to look at one.
Ooh, good question. If it was, then I don't want it anymore. But It's,
And then its other biggest addition, and probably most significant, it actually had a built-in memory manager.
there you go. Yep.
It was
Yep.
the only 3DO to have one of these, which is
Yeah.
still pretty interesting.
Well, it's good they kind of they realized that and made it happen. Just looking at pictures of it right now and just formulating my own opinion on why they didn't bring out this they didn't bring this out first is because it looks like a Sega CD,
It does.
or
It
at
looks
least
kind of
loosely.
it looks like kind of a cross between a Sega CD and the Amiga CD32 thing.
Ooh, you went deep with the Amiga. I love it.
Yeah, so
Yes.
that's another fascinating thing from that period of time.
Oh yeah.
So actually, before we talk, because I do want to briefly touch on the M2, I
Yeah.
think we should talk about the quote unquote canceled or prototype 3DOs that never released.
Yeah. So, we got to think about the time that 3DO was coming up. It was. I'll steal this from another show, and I can't remember who said it, but it was kind of the Me Too era of video games, and not to be confused with the current social issues, but it was the time where everybody was getting in on the video game industry because
Yes.
they saw that it was definitely lucrative. Two of those being AT&T and Samsung,
Yes.
and still very 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 interesting that the designs of both of those consoles were pretty similar into like the somewhere between the Gold Star and the Sanyo, but it's just interesting how those didn't happen, and I'm not sure why, other than maybe just somebody had some good business sense and said, hey, maybe we sit this one out.
So what's interesting about the Samsung, there's not a lot of information on it. There is one prototype in existence that does function apparently. The controller that comes with it, it looks, I swear it's probably just a Panasonic controller. What's interesting about it though was it was supposedly it had an MPEG decoder built into it, and it apparently also had native VCD playback, which what would have been significant at the time. Not sure what that would mean to anybody nowadays.
So I've heard that VCDs are still kind of a thing in Japan, at least. I don't know
Okay.
if that's true or not. Somebody might have to comment in and tell us if this is a thing or not. But I've kind of heard through a couple of different YouTube videos and such that it is kind of still a thing. I don't know if that's like it's like a thing as vinyl records are still a thing, or old compact discs, but yeah, it's kind of neat. The
What's
early days of sort of
yeah,
Blu-ray, well, not Blu-ray or DVD.
yeah. What's funny looking at the prototype though is it is the most VCR looking out of all of these. It looks so nothing like a game console. Like if their controller wasn't there, I'd literally think it's just some generic off the shelf whatever.
Yep,
It's
yep.
actually really cool looking though at the same time. Like it's interesting. I kind of wish it existed, but at the same time, it would have probably been a massive waste of money.
Do you know where it is, or since there's only one out there, is it in some like video game
It doesn't.
historical?
So I find all of these off. There's a website. It's like the 3DO archive. Um, it doesn't really say. I assume it's probably at Samsung HQ or something,
Hmm.
or maybe some private collector owns it. All we know is that it existed, but the plug was pulled after 3DO's stock dropped in '95.
Okay.
Because then after that, then we get the AT&T model, and this one is also kind of interesting because AT&T actually made the GPU for the system. So that's kind of how their involvement began. And they planned to release their own system, but obviously it never came out. The reason why theirs didn't come out, though, is a little interesting.
Okay.
Apparently, the system's body lines are actually almost a perfect match to the FC1. But apparently, like, there was, like, some sort of, like, issues with it, and it led to, like, they had to scrap something despite, like, there being like I don't know, it's weird. It had something to do with like it being like somewhat of a clone of the FC1 in a lot of ways.
Huh. So maybe they were worried about the kind of the negative connotation that they had built with the FC1, and knowing that the 3DO was kind of dying. Maybe they wanted. They said, "Hey, I don't think that
Maybe.
design's going to work out." I don't know. Again, I'm just
What
speculating and
What's funny though
dreaming
is
up my own
they
ideas.
claim the body lines are like the same, but if you look at the actual pictures of it,
Mm.
if anything, it actually kind of reminds me of, this is very obscure, but the Apple Bandai Pippin.
Ooh,
If
gosh.
anyone remembers that thing.
Oh my goodness, you're taking it back. I love this. I love this show. uh, yeah, I could see that. I'm looking at a picture of it right now. It looks very similar.
Now, I don't know if this one actually functioned because it doesn't really say. But at the same time, I'm assuming this prototype exists somewhere as well. I hope these still exist because it'd be a real shame if they didn't.
The AT&T variant. I don't know. I'm gonna have to just do a who has it Google. I don't know. Maybe it's another one that resides somewhere in the manufacturer's
It's kind of like that
base.
That Sega Neptune that exists, the one Neptune.
Yeah. Well, and then I think there's a couple of Nintendo PlayStations out there too.
Mm. Yeah, the YouTuber John Hancock, he has one. Well,
John Hancock. That's it. Yes.
he had one and he was trying to get it to work. I'm not sure if he actually did though.
Yeah. I love those. I mean, and it's funny. I'll watch those videos. Like I watched them and I watch them again and again just because I love hearing it over and over again.
Yeah, it's so
It,
fascinating, like all that stuff.
it really is. It really is.
Hmm. Now, I guess like the last 3DO that did exist was, well, didn't exist, but it was a proven concept, was the Toshiba 3DO and US West TV interactive TV.
The
That's a
Toshiba.
mouthful.
Yes. Toshiba 3DO.
So supposedly it was a portable 3DO that would work in vehicles, like on the vehicle TVs. It apparently didn't get very far in development, and there's no actual images of it. But it does appear that it had like this weird like interface where you'd like kind of like scroll around different like buildings to find different like menus and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like some sort of
Yeah.
educate. It looks like an educational tool, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah. I mean, I could see this in the back of like a Toyota Century carrying some big wig executive around Tokyo. I could definitely see that with one of these.
Yeah, it's kind
But
of.
also kind of predating it, like kind of what we think of as modern day tablets. And not that
Mm,
it led to that, but it's again just a testament to it being ahead of its time. I think on top of the non-family friendly stuff that 3DO put out, there is also a lot of educational content
it was.
and software, which you could probably talk about in another episode. But um, I remember even just playing putt putt and putting my little brother in front of that because he was much younger than me and he loved that game. And
I always
I,
thought it was. I played those games growing up as a child, and it was always funny to me that I didn't know that they were, because they were. I played them on PC, obviously back in the day. There was just something funny learning, like, wow, these came out on a console of all things.
yeah, I mean, and it looked good too. I mean, the animation was solid. I mean,
I will say, like, the 3DO probably had the best looking full motion video out of any console.
until PlayStation, and that's like I said, that's when I shed a tear is when I saw
Yeah.
one of the cutscenes for Rebel Assault, and I was like, oh man, this looks so much sharper. And like, I don't want to go through all of this again and buy a whole nother system, but yeah, for the time, gosh, there was nothing better. There's nothing better out there.
Now, I guess before we wrap it up, I'm probably gonna touch on it more in a future episode, but I would like to just touch on the M2 real quick.
Okay, so
So,
the future event of 3DO that didn't happen,
sort of, sort of.
sort of.
Um, so this console has the most confusing name because some people call it the 3DO M2, others call it the Panasonic M2 because 3DO eventually sold the rights to its hardware directly to Panasonic. which actually pissed off Gold Star and Sanyo, I believe I read, because it basically took away any sort of like rights they had to possibly to make 3DO stuff.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I could see that. I could see that
So
driving a wedge in the relationship.
yeah. So what's funny about the M2 is there are like prototypes of what it was supposed to look like. And honestly, it looks more like a video game console than I guess like the original 3DO looked. But at the same time, it looks like a dev kit, to be honest. And I'm not sure if it is or isn't.
With the M2, that's a very confusing thing for me. I often wonder if that dev kit look of it was intentional, because we do see that it was used for arcade games,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm wondering if that was on purpose. I guess I don't know.
What
I
I
just
find, oh sorry,
there's so many good ideas baked into this M2, and this is where I start to drop off in my knowledge of all of it. But I don't see how they could have in any stretch of their imagination thought that this was going to be a thing that happened based on how badly the business was doing.
mm-hmm. So I would like to point out one thing that I find interesting is if you look at the M2, the prototype, I guess you could say, I notice it has two controller ports, which is interesting considering the whole gimmick of the 3DO was the one controller port.
You know, the 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 gimmick of the single 3DO controller port, I feel was, and it's terrible to say because I don't think there are really any cost cutting measures done for this system. But on top of it being a gimmick, I feel like it was kind of a cost cutting measure,
I think,
to only have one controller
yeah.
port.
I think me and Josh had like kind of like agreed that the whole I think it was more of like it had to do more with the whole video game standard aspect where they wanted all the systems to be standard like in uniform
Yeah,
in a sense.
yeah.
Because the M2 looks more like a video game console than a entertainment center in a lot of ways.
It gives me PlayStation vibes for sure.
It does. Actually, I got like Saturn vibes from it more than anything.
Saturn, yeah. The square one's definitely Saturn. There's a few different pictures of it, but yeah, definitely Saturn. A
Now
little bit
we
of
touched
PlayStation.
that it kind of did exist in a sense. Like it wasn't like a complete like it never you never materialized because it was eventually used in like a lot of Konami arcade cabinets.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe it actually ran off like a compact disc, like the actual cabinets did, and they were prone to burning out from what I've read.
Well, yeah. I mean that would make sense. I mean, you only get so much life out of a laser arcade cabinet that's running 24 hours.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, as long as the office hours are business hours.
Yeah, I've
so-
seen some. I've seen some footage of like the M2 games running, and it's very hard to judge graphically where exactly that was, especially compared to the PlayStation and Saturn at the time. But it looked at least on par with early PlayStation and definitely on par with Saturn, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and I haven't seen a lot of those games running. So yeah, I'd have to look at those, but I mean, it had better be on par with at least that generation.
Yeah.
And I think it would be. I mean, as awesome as everything on 3DO looked for the time, I can only imagine it would have been great. It would have been awesome to see this thing succeed and kind of go on to be a player in the console wars today.
Mm.
But
It's honestly kind of a shame.
That reality.
It really had everything it needed to be successful, and they just one key mistake right at the beginning basically killed any chance it had, and that was just that $700 price tag. They just could never recover from that.
Nope, no, they couldn't.
It's a shame because honestly, I feel like I don't think the whole idea behind 3DO, like the the video game standard would have succeeded, but I feel like the company could have succeeded. I mean, they did make it till 2003, the company itself.
Yeah.
I mean, they were horribly mismanaged by then, but they, I think the system could have lasted. It was unfortunate.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, it's just such a sad story. Like I said, I feel like it's probably one of the most tragic stories in gaming as far as I'm concerned, just because the potential was there, everything was there. It just didn't happen.
Mm. And then following the story of the company itself after that gets even more tragic the more you look into it.
Yeah, yeah. I don't want to be that depressed tonight.
I want to save the story about I want to save like the 3DO company's post console story for later, anyways. But I think we've basically covered just about everything about the system itself. Do you have any final closing remarks? Or
No, I just want to thank you so much for having me on the show. I love talking about this, and I feel like I learned more from you than I knew, and I really appreciate that. So, thank you. I hope this podcast sees many more episodes. And just talking to you today, it just feels like there's so much to talk about. I mean, you've really got a good runway of content to go over from different software, different games, different types of games. I mean, the 3DO is just so rich with history, with content, and I look forward to the next episodes, and I hope everybody listening enjoys it too, and subscribes to the show, and just wishing you all the luck on this, and I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.
thanks. Now, do you want to plug your stuff real quick again, or?
Yeah, so I stream as a hobby. So I'm on twitch.tv/desert level gaming. You can also find some of my past podcast episodes on any of the podcast, whichever podcast platform you like the best at Gaming in the Desert. I think you've inspired me to maybe get back on that and start doing it again more frequently. So, yeah, thank you so much again for having me on. I really appreciate it. And it was a blast talking to you.
No, it was great. It was honestly just great having someone who actually played the system like back in the day and like actually like could give me insight, because I learned a bunch too today, and that was honestly that's what I wanted with this show. And it was great. Thank you again.
All right, so I'm going to pledge then. So the next games I'm going to stream will be 3DO games. So
Nice.
if you catch me on, I will be doing some shock. I've been playing a lot of Shockwave lately,
Nice.
and I don't know why, other than I've been just kind of not comparing it, but kind of comparing it with Star Fox, and I like it more just because I love the little video cutscenes while you're going to town. Your captain's yelling at you, your crew's yelling at you. Maybe it's because I just watched some Top Gun too, and I feel like I'm in the danger zone with that. So yeah, I will definitely be streaming some 3DO more regularly.
Nice. And I'll add the links and stuff, everything into the description for the episode.
Okay.
All right. And once again, guys, thanks. Yep. Once again, guys, thanks for joining me on the 3DO Experience. 3DO Experience can be found on all your major podcasting platforms, and we will see you all next time.
If you're not playing on a 3DO system, what are you playing with?